Welcome to Grown Between Worlds, a podcast for adult children of immigrants and the people who love them. We're here to hold real conversations about identity, belonging, love, and life across cultures.
And we're committed to creating a space that feels grounding, honest, and human. Each conversation here touches on sensitive themes, which may feel deep or tender. We invite you to listen or watch at your own pace and take good care of yourself.
I'm Forouz.
And I'm Miranda. We're so glad you're on this journey with us.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Today's guest is Tracey Jastinder Mann. They are a practicing psychotherapist and a queer femme of color who is working to support collective healing and liberation through their offerings of individual counseling, group facilitation, and workshops. Their work is centered in an intersectional feminist approach to therapy and facilitation, and their focus is on creating a healing space where individuals can explore the emotional dimensions of life changes, experiences of trauma, grief, and loss, while also attempting to understand how experiences of marginalization, privilege, and power influence our lived experiences. Welcome, Tracey. We're so happy to have you here today.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me, Forouz.
Well, tell us a little bit about your personal connection to immigration.
Yeah, so it's interesting. My migration experience is multi-generational. And so it seems that um, there's been so many experiences of migration in my family system. My grandfather came to Canada in 1927 when he was 7. And
Wow.
so his parents sent him as the only child with his uncle and grandfather. And so he came and he was selling apple and milk on the corners of Victoria. Um, and and then didn't see his family for 30 years. And his first trip back to India was to marry my grandmother in 1949. And then they came back with my grandmother's sister, who actually had met my grandfather in Canada and suggested that he check out my grandmother as a prospective bride. And it was interesting, on my great uncle, the one who suggested my grandfather consider my grandmother as an option, he left from India to originally, I think his objective was to get to Canada or to the US, but he came through the Panama Canal and then spent 7 years kind of stuck in Mexico and worked as a porter and kept trying to make it up along the west coast to Canada, but immigration kept sending him back. So my aunt and him were reunited 8 years after being married. And so
Wow.
the struggle for migration has been a longstanding felt experience within my family system.
Mhm.
And this was all during the time that India was under the colonial rule of the British Raj. And so I can't imagine what my grandfather's experience was like, having left India and then returning post-independence. And this is kind of like the time where lots of conflict was happening. There's migration has been longstanding. The other experience is that my father was born in India and came to Canada in 1973 and met my mother through painting my grandfather's house and through their connection at the Gurdwara in Victoria. And he also had his own migration experience. So my relationship to immigration is deeply personal, but it's also quite political. And that was kind of illustrated to me throughout my life, but I don't think I had a very strong articulation of privilege and power and what it really meant early on. But I could see that there were forces beyond just what was happening within my family that really left me with questions about what was happening and why immigration or why people migrating was bad. And that was definitely a felt sense growing up.
Mm.
And thankfully, my family was open to talk about these pieces and were a little more politicized in their understandings. And so it helped me understand that borders aren't just geographic. They're these spaces that are deeply fraught with emotion. They have psychological and relational impacts. And, my experience was around the pressure to assimilate
Mm.
and, really feeling that there's this fear of being too much or not enough. And so it really something that in my early 20s gave me a lot of language to really understand these experiences was in reading the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, whose work in Borderlands or La Frontera started to give language to something that I felt throughout my life but didn't have the language for. And that when we exist in these borderlands, we're forced to inhabit contradictions, and then our bodies are the sites of these tension, navigating these contradictions. And so, how do we hold kind of pain and joy simultaneously? And knowing that these contradictions might wound you, and how do you navigate those wounds without losing a sense of self? And what is sense of self when there's expectations in your family of origin about how you perform, and then, in this new assimilationist space that you're in. And so it was really about how do I find myself in a space of these seeming contradictions, and how do I find belonging? How do I find an identity? And another more recent iteration of migration is that my partner is Cuban and had a very difficult migration experience coming to Canada.
Wow.
We uh, partnered in 2019, and then we married in 2020 in Cuba, and then lockdown happened literally like 3 weeks after we got married.
Wow.
And so when I had checked wait times on Immigration Canada's website, prior to lockdown, it was kind of like, okay, it'll maybe take 8 months for my partner to get here. And that turned into a almost 4-year migration journey that was very difficult and had significant consequences. And so immigration's not just a memory that's historical in my family of origin, but it's an ongoing active force in my daily life. Contemporary immigration really infiltrates these intimacies that we have in our life. Bureaucracy, paperwork delays, the introduction, in our case, of AI to evaluate the documents.
Mm.
Our process got delayed because apparently AI technology was introduced at that time, and paperwork that was actually included in our package, if a human had verified that, they would see that my stepdaughter's birth certificate was there. But the AI filtration decided that it wasn't there. And I had no understanding of how to navigate that system. And so we had to reapply, delaying our process by years.
Wow.
And so it's hard because then in this way, love, family, belonging, togetherness exists along surveillance, fear, and border regimes. And so we're left with no alternatives but to be subject to colonial understandings of family, belonging, and who deserves to be in this space on stolen land.
Yeah.
So for me, a comrade, an ally, a friend, Harsha Walia, who I organized with in No One is Illegal on unceded Coast Salish territories, introduced the really important concept of border imperialism. And I think it's important to understand that borders are not failures of compassion. They function exactly as designed. And they allow imperial powers to, like states like the US and Canada, to extract labor from individuals, to go into regions, destabilize them through their foreign policy initiatives, extracting resources and profit from those spaces alongside criminalizing the very people that they displace by these actions. And so it is impossible for me to separate how my experience of love, family, belonging is often cleaved and fractured by migration. So immigration isn't just policy, it's how empire infiltrates our relationships.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It sounds like you certainly have had a very multi-generational experience of migration in your life. And I really liked how you talked about the contradictions, right? The feeling like too much or not enough, the pain and the joy simultaneously, the kind of the burden of and the challenges of trying to integrate and hold on to heritage while going through assimilation, right? That these contradictions are so real for people who have had histories of migration in their lives and in their families. Yeah. Thank you. I know that in addition to being a therapist, you've done a lot of migrant justice work, particularly around the sociopolitical dynamic of race and power and how it impacts the migration and settlement process. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned through this work.
It has been like an ongoing learning, and um, I originally started off as a young environmental activist at 9, and then started to get more involved in environmental work and more, and through the anti-globalization movement, my politicization helped me understand better, or thankfully being exposed to some incredible thinkers really started having me question how ecological in nature and how connected all of these global problems are. And that resource extraction, environmental degradation, and climate change cannot be separate or viewed as distinct from the challenges of migration, displacement, and that they're so deeply embedded. And so what brought me to this work is joining a migrant justice collective in 2008. I started to attend more events, 2009, becoming a member of No One is Illegal. And through that journey, really was better able to articulate that migration is not an individual problem, it's a structural outcome. No one is choosing to migrate in a vacuum. People are displaced or forced to move as longstanding patterns of colonization, war, trade agreements, climate collapse, land dispossession, economic policies, and wars that benefit the global north at the expense of the global south. And from intersectional feminist perspectives of Black feminist scholars, remind us that these don't have equal impact. Just because you're a migrant doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to experience these things. Women, queer and trans migrants, individuals who are disabled by the system, Black and Indigenous migrants experience disproportionate harm. So migration is not even neutral. It is still informed by white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, to quote bell hooks. And so working with No One is Illegal and learning from other organizations across south of the border like Mi Gente have been instrumental in articulating how migrant justice must be anti-racist, must be abolitionist, and anti-imperialist at the same time. And there's, I think there's a necessary understanding that we can't separate what we're seeing in terms of immigration enforcement from policing, incarceration, and surveillance. ICE, as we see these raids happening, didn't emerge coincidentally or accidentally. It was an intentional creation of the post 9/11 security state, and it's an apparatus to merge immigration, counterterrorism, and militarized policing. And today, ICE and our Canadian equivalent, the CSB, or like Canadian Border Patrol Services, function as domestic extensions of imperial powers that are designed to enforce racial hierarchies and operate under the guise of law and order. So under the US and Canadian policies that are recently being expanded upon, we've seen the expansion of enforcement infrastructure and militarization. The CBP-1 visa in the US, which was to digitalize asylum access, have turned protection into technological gatekeeping system that prevents migration for those who don't have access to technology or resources or the literacy to be able to navigate these systems. As we've seen the violent and horrific state violence enacted through ICE raids, we, it's there's this false discourse of humane enforcement when really it's about instating fear. And what it's kind of functioning to say is that none of us are necessarily safe. Even those who have citizenship, even those who have have papers, we are also under surveillance and that we are kind of encouraged to surveil each other. A troubling thing is that many Canadians, I see this on social media and in mainstream media, Canada likes to believe of itself as a more benevolent force. But our migrant justice work has really revealed a different and very harrowing story. Things like the Safe Third Country Agreement, Canada is actually colluding with the US to deny asylum seekers access to protection. And we outsource border violence while maintaining a humanitarian image. So in many ways, we are co-signing the US's violence by upholding legislation like Safe Third Country agreements. Recent legislations like Bill C-12 expands border surveillance and enforcement. And I would say that our current, Prime Minister Carney is increasing targets towards deportation. So we can expect increased enforcement authority, a shift to securitization and militarization rather than care. So Canada is not outside of border imperialism. We are an active and complicit partner within it. So migrant justice has also taught me that alongside these struggles for a freedom to move, a freedom to stay, a freedom to return, that is not a conversation that we can have in a vacuum, and that there's an important recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. So borders also cut through Indigenous lands that were established through settler colonial violence. And now settler colonialism informs who is a legitimate migrant and who is not. So resistance to border imperialism must not replicate settler logics, because we will continue then to reproduce the very same harms that we are positioned to untangle. So migrant justice must exist in solidarity with Indigenous self-determination, land defense, and treaty rights. And otherwise, we will continue this horrific game of dispossession and resource extraction, and really fundamentally continue to perpetuate violence if we don't understand how these are interconnected.
Mhm. Well, that was a very rich description of all of these, different geopolitical issues, economic disparities, identity-based discrimination, environmental issues that often displace people and force them to have to move, right? And you've given us a really good description of that and a good reminder for us, especially those living who've settled in Canada and living in Canada, to remember that this is not like the perfect place. This is not the perfect land, and the decisions that we are all a part of in one way or another are not perfect either. And that when we're looking at freedom to move and stay and return, that those conversations can't be done without conversations that also include solidarity with Indigenous sovereigns. And that really reminds me, like growing up here after immigrating, and how little I actually learned about Indigenous communities in, public school systems. And it wasn't until I went into university, and only because I chose to study cultural anthropology, that I was introduced to real experiences of Indigenous people here in Canada and the injustice towards them. And it was only when I entered into university that I realized that as a first generation immigrant to Canada, I was a settler. I had no idea, because this wasn't at all part of the education. It wasn't part of the discourse even for migrants, that it was like you immigrate and you come here, and you're meant to assimilate to the dominant host culture, which in Canada is primarily British, but it completely erases the Indigenous communities and people that have been here for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And how effortful we have to be and intentional we have to be to even learn about these people that have been here on this land. And it's not something that's kind of like part of our general everyday discourse. It certainly wasn't in the 90s when my family immigrated here, and even in the early 2000s.
And that's why it's so frightening to witness the dismantling of education systems, the imposition of book bans, and this very anti-woke discourse, which means that we're really preventing people to have critical conversations, critically informed dialogue, and we're saying that there's only, a certain kind of discourse that we're going to uphold. So we've seen that predominantly in the US, but we're starting to see that in Alberta. And I'm certain that there are many individuals who would like to see that expanded across Canada, where
Mm,
we are not provided access to information. We've come so far, and we have so much further to go.
mhm,
However, there is a real threat that being able to have a diversity of perspectives and understandings about Canada's colonial history is threatened to be erased. And without those conversations, we also lose something as migrants, which is ability to talk about our own experiences with imperialism and colonization. And so it's another way that assimilation is demanded,
mhm.
as an expectation. And it's a way that we're monitored and policed.
Yeah, it erases, like you said, the history and the heritage and the multi-generational impacts of colonization
Yeah.
across the
And I
world.
would across the world. And I would say, xenophobia may have been more subtle in the past, but it's increasing now. And
Mhm,
now it's so blatant and overt, and
mhm,
there's no recourse or accountability. And individuals can say whatever they want. They can promote hate, and we are being shown that individuals who engage in those behaviors are beyond impunity because they are state actors. And so we are seeing a rise of fascism. And so I'm very concerned about what this means for migrants and our
mhm.
experiences.
What are some of the recent iterations of xenophobia that often come up in your conversations with your immigrant clients?
And so, yeah, it's interesting because I'm really noticing a shift. So,
Mhm,
5 years ago, I would have said, it's kind of like these very quiet, passive gestures. Now it's becoming more emboldened again.
mhm,
And so now it is like, so I would have said before it wasn't explicit hatred. Today, I would say that there's explicit hatred that we're navigating alongside policy bureaucracy, plausibly deniable narratives. So, we hear discourses and post COVID, this has become a discourse that, oh no, like our housing costs have gone up, not because of capitalism and that we've taken something like housing that should have been a right and made it a commodity. Let's not talk about capitalism or our economic framework or how banks profit from spiraling mortgage rates. Let's not talk about that. And let's scapegoat immigrants and migrants and say that there is strain on resources. They drive up property houses. They're taking our homes. They're taking our jobs. So now we have these deeply racialized narrative, you know, and so it's really telling to me that so interesting if we look at what's been happening in the Ukraine. Canada provided nearly 1 million visas to Ukrainian refugees to be able to come to Canada. I did not hear any anti-Ukrainian sentiment at all. And I don't know, have you heard anything in the mainstream media like saying that too many Ukrainians are coming here?
I haven't, and not that any refugee population should be receiving any form of hatred
Exactly.
or discrimination when they are trying to flee to some form of safety. Yeah,
And so we can be in our humanity in those moments in
yeah,
a collective way to say, you deserve safety, you have a place here.
yeah,
But in Syria,
mhm.
Canada only let in, I think, under 30,000 people in 10 years.
Yeah, it's a
So we
huge
see
disparity.
it's a huge disparity. So
Yeah,
we see the racialization and gendered ways that fear is enacted to create a very white supremacist discourse of belonging and acceptance. And so many people who are migrants who are just really trying to find safety, a better life, because imperialism is coming in and destroying their countries and economies and their democracies. And then to try to flee that, you're called a criminal, you know? And now you fear confinement, you fear being kidnapped, because I'm going to say that these ICE raids are kidnapping. Places of safety like schools, hospitals, courthouses are no longer safe. It's not safe to access medical care, mental health support, legal protection, because there are fears of deportation. So this is not accidental. This is a strategy to let us know who is in charge, who is welcome, and who is not.
Mhm.
So a thing that I see within my clients then is, because this messaging is so pervasive,
Right.
we see internalized xenophobia, internalized racism, and we see this myth of the model minority being operationalized within their nervous systems. We see individuals saying that I have to earn my right to be here. I have to be perfect. I have to overwork. I have to be quiet. I have to be grateful. And then we're not allowed rest. We're not allowed joy. We're not allowed self-compassion. We're not allowed to talk about the geopolitical causes as to why we are in these conditions in the first place. And
Mhm.
as you said, with the education system, we're being taught that we're disposable and that there's an erasure of those histories. So intersectional feminist perspectives help us understand that this is structural violence, and where systems create conditions where people blame themselves for the harms that are a result of structural state violence. It is so painful. So I see my role as a therapist to really undo those harms, to say, hey, where are we talking about these structural experiences? Did and so I really feel it's so important therapeutically to create a space where the political is personal and the personal is political,
Mhm.
because otherwise we internalize these violences and then we arrange our whole life and our whole identity to seek belonging in a system that will never accept us. Something that stood out to me was when I was 9, my dad is in construction, and at the time in the late 80s, there was a discourse in BC, where I'm from the West Coast. And so there was a discourse in BC about Asian invasion and monster homes.
Mm.
And so unknowingly, my father agreed to do a newspaper interview with a publication called the Times Columnist. So I know
Mm.
just that name of that paper gives me the chills. So
Mm.
the Times Columnist said, "Oh, we're so interested in learning about your construction." And so then my father appears in the paper, Asian invasion, monster homes, and
Wow.
he's made into a test case. The home that he was building was for a migrant family who'd been in Victoria for 20 years. This was the first home they had rented before. This was their first home that they were going to own.
Mm.
3 days later, their entire brand new home is covered in swastikas and spray painted with Pakis Go Home.
Mm.
And my 9-year-old brain was confused, thinking, we're not Pakis. we're Indian. We're Punjabis. Like, I think they meant this for someone else. I couldn't
Mm.
conceive of in my 9-year-old brain where this was coming from.
Mhm.
So, and then in those experiences of violence, there's all these moments of code switching. Can I say anything? Can I name my experience? Can I talk about these violences that we're experiencing? And if you do, it's personal and people will attack you. And so I learned to stay silent.
Mhm.
I learned to say, okay, I'm going to be that model minority. I'm going to do all the things, and realizing doing all the things was never going to protect me. Being academically studious, um, going to Canada Day events, learning about Canadian culture and assimilating and internalizing these behaviors was not going to protect me. And so there is this constant navigating of these chasms, and I really try to support my clients to understand that you're not broken, or and that this split is emerging because you feel stretched, not
Yeah.
because you're doing something wrong.
Mhm.
And so you're responding exactly as a human being would to an inhumane system.
Yes. Yes. Yes, that perfectionism, the drive to be a perfectionist,
Yeah.
the kind of intense anxiety that it also cultivates that's like enmeshed with perfectionism, and the recurring burnout that happens for
Yes.
folks when they're stuck in this constant striving to be perfect simply for safety and belonging, right? It becomes a trauma response essentially. That
Exactly.
And it's one that's positively reinforced by the societies in which we settle, because it makes us, especially within a capitalist society, it makes us more productive, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just reinforced and reinforced and reinforced until people kind of continue to hit all these different blocks where they're just burnt out year after year after year, and the cumulative effect of that on their mental health, on their physical health, on their capacity to even engage socially with loved ones and with community, their capacity to you know engage in opportunities for like leisure and joy and growth, they kind of dwindle over time more and more and more.
Yeah. And again, drawing from the work of Gloria and Zaldua, borderlands become a site of pain, but also a site of transformation. And
Right.
so we're living between these worlds. And, a journey that I try to support folks to understand is that you're not lacking coherence,
Mhm.
but it means that you're being forced to navigate multiple truths.
Mhm.
And all of those truths aren't always welcome in all spaces. And so you're carrying this body of knowledge that sometimes we're not allowed to speak. And
Mhm.
so this like survival under empire, we're having to be creative, we're having to be adaptable, and we're trying to seek collective care, but sometimes there's an absence of that. And so it's, navigating that deep grief and pain of this multi-years process where your kind of like nervous system is like ripped open and totally raw.
Mhm.
And I've
Yeah.
even seen that like my partners in about a year and a half into their migration experience alongside my stepdaughter. And so they're kind of living between these worlds and then also processing all of the trauma of their journey. They came to the US by way of Nicaragua. They had coyotes bring them, and so they came from Nicaragua all the way up through Central America, through Mexico, got abandoned by a coyote, had to find a new coyote, were almost kidnapped, took buses, boats, um, and they're still they haven't even had a chance to process that trauma.
Mhm.
And so when they arrived to the US, I remember meeting them at the airport, and as we were flying, like we were taking a taxi to the place that we were going to stay, my stepdaughter, I said, "Oh, like when it's summer, we can go on this boat." And she went silent.
Mhm.
And she said, "I'm never going on a boat again."
Mm.
So there's these ways that
Yeah.
trauma um, infiltrates our bodies. And, and just knowing that most recently, children have been separated from their parents. Young people are having to navigate these fears of separation and violence. It it is it is so hard as a therapist to hear the ways that people internalize that as a failure of themselves or their families or their identity when what we are experiencing is structural violence.
Mhm.
And so I think immigration trauma in particular doesn't always announce itself as like capital T trauma.
Mhm.
There can be hypervigilance, guilt, emotional shutdown.
Shame.
And so it's learn shame, you know, and really looking at how there has been a systematic extraction of safety,
Mhm.
that people have to live in constant fear and threat. And we're
Mhm.
creating these conditions. We look at our temporary foreign worker systems, for example, and it's constant precariousness. You don't get EI benefits, you don't get health care, you don't have access to a guaranteed return. And so we're just extracting labor from people. And we abolished this. We at one point in history said that, slavery is not okay. But we don't look at the ways that we reproduce those mechanisms through policies and bureaucratic frameworks, and that we're often creating these systems of extraction. And
Mm,
for whose gain? For whose benefit?
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you're touching on that, like the internalization of all of these different forms of discrimination and oppression are one of the ways that we, try to regain a sense of control over a situation that's completely outside of our control, right?
Yeah.
That if we internalize it and we see it as an individual problem or as a problem of our family system, then our mind feels like it can try to calculate a way out of this problem or this form of like suffering that's been going on for so long. And so
Yeah.
I definitely see it a lot with my clients as well, and trying to like talk to them about this and try to untangle it. It's like in some ways it's like an adaptive response in a situation where we have so little control and there's so much uncertainty and there's so much suffering that internalizing it and seeing it as a personal problem in some way helps us feel like we're in control. Maybe I can do something about this and have us become more engaged in some way in our lives again. But then we're turning everything against ourselves, right? There's already so many different systems and structures that can be causing us harm. And then we could be causing ourselves further harm with additional self criticism, like this constant moving of the goalposts of what you're supposed to achieve or who you're supposed to become and what you're supposed to be doing in this world to try and ensure your own and your family's safety and prosperity.
Yeah. And mental health institutions can be quite harmful, if we don't have this politicized understanding. Because then we can say, let's like change your thoughts, good vibes only,
Hmm.
and there can be these narratives that have some therapeutic interventions might not be appropriate for individuals navigating structural violence when we're not naming that structural violence. Because then you still feel like I have to progress, I have to evolve myself, and that the problem is not centered in experiences that are beyond me, it's centered within myself. And I have to take within my locus of control and try to transform myself. And that is another form of violence.
Yeah.
And sometimes individual interventions aren't possible. Sometimes social determinants of health and structural change are the only antidotes to this trauma.
Yeah.
So migrant justice isn't about better borders, but it's imagining a world that exists beyond borders,
Hmm.
where we're not criminalizing movement, where Indigenous sovereignty is respected, and where care is at the center of
Hmm.
how we're navigating our relationships, not punishment and policing.
Hmm.
And so, some of the examinations that we need to consider is that Canada is not about creating a system of belonging, a system of care. It's about policing and extraction. And so I think, recentering those dialogues and those conversations in a therapeutic way can be liberatory.
Yeah, and sometimes it's the first time that someone is looking at their own experiences with this lens and contextualizing their own experiences within these larger systems. And I know in my work with my clients, it's simultaneously really enlightening and can bring about a lot more opportunities to practice like self compassion and self acceptance. And at the same time, it can also activate a lot of rage. But the rage has
Yeah.
always been there. The rage has been like suffocated to be able to survive and to be able to, assimilate effectively and function in this society, in this world. And it's been waiting. It's been waiting for an opportunity to be noticed and kind of worked through and released in some way. But then so many of us, so many of my clients are so frightened of that rage, right? Because rage and anger, the difference between anger and rage is an interesting thing. And I've looked at Ruth King's work to try and kind of understand that difference where anger is kind of more of a momentary experience, a response to something that's happening in the moment, whereas rage is this accumulation. And often it can even be intergenerational and passed down to us, right? And it's accumulation of the impacts of suffering and having to kind of silence that for safety, right? For safety and for belonging. Um, and so working through that is really important and really powerful. And it can also help us to tap into a level of like energy and creativity that we've been keeping kind of like suffocated for so long, because anger and rage do have a lot of power and energy with them, right? Like they can be connected to our life force energy.
And I think what you've named, and I haven't quite been able to name it, so thank you so much. But I think that's what drew me to organizing and activism was feeling this deep sense of injustice. And I think it's a righteous kind of anger, you
Hmm.
know, and not knowing where to put that and having a political home and organizing space allowed me to tap into creative connections with others. It built such a space of solidarity, mutual aid, collective care. And it was such a transformative space that something like my anger about these injustices or this deep rage that I would agree was intergenerational. It was like,
Hmm.
so deep and so profound that it finally had this space and it was really beautiful.
Hmm.
Sometimes when our anger can be channeled in a way that's transformative, and I found for me in a collective way, it allowed me to feel attuned to a type of power that wasn't power over, but power together and power within. Quoting Starhawk, who had imagined these different conceptualizations of power. And
Hmm.
so it was so important to me to have that space because there was a healing of being in solidarity with others and not feeling alone.
Hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of my clients as well find engaging in advocacy or activism as a supportive way for them to channel their rage and find a space for it to be able to move through and become an action oriented part of life and the world. And I have clients who that's not really their avenue, right? Like that for
Of
multitude of
course.
reasons, being in an activist space is not the right fit for them and not the right
And might be
channel.
very triggering
Yeah,
and
for
very
sure.
traumatic. I hear you.
Yeah, so
Yes.
myself, for instance, I wouldn't identify myself as an activist. I'm much more of an advocate, and I think coming from a family where activism was a big part of involvement with the like 1979 revolution in Iran and the reasons behind migration within multiple families within my larger extended family, that activism feels unsafe. Right. For me, from a young age, I learned, and before we even immigrated, it was like it's kind of like seeped into every cell of my body of like activism isn't safe for me or for my family. So especially after even
Yeah.
we immigrated, I was very, very frightened of being in activist spaces, like going to even like Labor Day demonstrations or even like smaller scale protests and things was so intensely activating for my nervous system, where then I would be like out of commission for days afterwards. And I wasn't able to kind of regulate myself. And even though I wasn't involved in the, revolution myself, it's clearly a part of like the epigenetics of who I am, and impacts how my nervous system responds to these different situations, even though I technically have a lot more safety, after having settled in Canada, after becoming a citizen. I also have like white passing privilege in a lot of spaces, right? And still, it's so overactivating for my nervous system. I think having that lived experience also helps me to have conversations with some of my clients who don't necessarily find activism as the right outlet for what they're feeling. And so movement is one of the things that we talk about. And a lot of folks, especially different forms of like martial arts, particularly if it's connected to their own cultural heritage in some way, or dance, especially if it's connected to their own like cultural heritage, can also be really beautiful ways to move that rage out. And also maybe sometimes for the first time ever using our vocal cords, using our voice to express the rage and externalize it from our bodies. We don't necessarily need to do it at whomever has done the harm, but even on our own, alone, to be saying it out loud, practicing using our vocal cords to connect to and to release that rage can also be very powerful.
Yeah. And these are technologies that we've always had.
Mhm,
Communities that engaged in war, we have war dances, war practices, and not because they're glamorizing war, but because many times communities are saying, you've done something to protect the community, but it has caused you harm and that we've harmed others too. So how do we be with our bodies? How do we drum? How do we dance? How do we
mhm,
sing? How do we recognize what's transpired and we're not going to ignore it? And we're missing those spaces of solidarity. You know,
yeah,
those spaces to commune, and it doesn't only need to happen through organizing. It can happen through as like group practices around dance, song, and those are such important technologies. And I think things like EMDR, like a trauma informed practice of bilateral stimulation, is really just taking these, you know, um, indigenous and culture, community of origin knowledges and transforming them into a psychological tool.
mhm, yeah,
Yeah.
very well put. Great. Well, I really appreciate the conversation that we've had. It's been so rich today. And as we're kind of winding down and wrapping up, I wanted to check in with you to see if there had been a guidebook for immigrant kids and teens or for people partnering with adult children of immigrants. What's one piece of advice or wisdom that you would want included in it?
I think it's sometimes hard for individuals to name migration as an experience of violence, as an
Mm,
experience of trauma. And so that you can't expect an individual to articulate that to you necessarily, but there are signs that we can look for. And so I think it's really about, understanding the histories that people come from, understanding the sociopolitical context that they're within, you know, um, and recognizing that behaviors that we might witness might be confusing to us, but that we need to have a broader lens to say, is this coming from somewhere else? Is it coming from your migration experience? If you're feeling big emotions, like there's so many there's so many pieces that someone who's migrating are navigating. So it's really and then I think we also have to be compassionate and interrogate our own proximity to safety,
mhm,
and that's something that we can't take for granted, you know? And that, and it's like, are we, if our, if someone we care about might not be able to engage in activism or organizing or advocacy, that might not be right for their nervous system at all. But can I do something? Can I stand up? Can I use my voice that's experiencing safety and resourcing perhaps to intervene from that place of understanding? Some of the other things that I would say is, really to not vilify their place of origin.
mm,
I think sometimes it's like, well, you were there and that's how things were done there. And people cling on to that. I even saw that in my own cultural community as a Sikh community. It became very insular. And I always hear about, these isolation or the bubbling that communities have done and saying that they're like rejecting culture. But what they're doing is preserving the little dignity that they have left,
mhm,
celebrating that, integrating practices. How do we celebrate your culture of origin? How do we integrate that into our day-to-day life practices? Um, what are the ways that we can reconnect with culture and community? Even now, like my partner's Cuban, and so we're taking Cuban salsa dance classes together, but just trying to do these things where they get to be close to music, community, embodiment that is reflective of their space of origin. So I think it's about how do we recognize the structural violence and then respond to that through interpersonal care and kindness.
mhm. Yeah, so being able to notice that it could be a trauma response that someone is expressing, right? The impacts of the trauma that they've experienced is being maybe expressed in their relationship to us in some way or another. And if
Yes.
we are going to be choosing to be a loved one and a community member of folks that have, legacies of immigration and migration in their lives, to take a little bit of time and educate ourselves about kind of the geopolitical issues, the economic disparities, identity based discriminations, the environmental issues that may have led them and their families to have to leave and be in the societies that we now are and be able to be in community with us now, so that we can at least, not to fully say that everything that's happening is as a result of that. It's not like a formulaic thing of one thing is leading to this other thing, but to simply be making the effort to educate ourselves a little bit, even, and stay open to their cultural practices. And it could be simple things like music and dance and food, to holidays, etc., to integrate that into our day-to-day lives and interactions, and celebrations with them.
Yeah. And that, it's a long journey, that
Hmm.
migration isn't like a 1-year thing. It, research around kind of like experiences of culture and belonging and feeling like safety and acceptance can vary for individuals, and it can take anywhere from 2 to 8 years,
Hmm.
depending on the individual and how much trauma, how much space and time to assimilate all this new information and integrate it and to process it. We don't always have that luxury and privilege,
And access to
and
the
the
resources
other
and
reality.
supports to do that.
Exactly. And so just being very patient and really being just in a space of solidarity, I think, are some of the things that we can do, and just recognizing, like, for example, I don't know how this is impacting you right now, and if it's okay, to ask, but there's been internet blackouts and a whole experience of, an uprising in Iran. Like, how is that impacting your nervous system? Even though you said, like, you've got citizenship, you've been here
Mhm.
for a while, there's a different space, like, I imagine that's running through your nervous system.
It is, and it's interesting because I find for myself, probably like many people, I kind of press snooze on my own deeper processing, especially because of the work that I do with my clients and because I want to be able to hold space for them to bring these different pieces and to be able to kind of like have these more politicized discussions, around what's happening for them. And that I kind of press snooze of it on it. And sometimes I can be a bit numb to seeing some of these things. And it's a self-protective mechanism for sure, but it's also a way for me to kind of do my best to try and stay grounded for the work that I'm doing with my clients. And the beauty of the work is also that in having these conversations with my clients, like things start to kind of fall into place within my own psyche and within my own body without necessarily it being about me and what I'm going through, but to kind of notice that, in that human connection with a client and these like human, honest, authentic conversations, that while the client is hopefully getting some healing benefits from that, that we as practitioners also, have a similar, not exactly the same, but like a similar process of healing happening within us as well through that human connection, right? And because of, at the very least, the strength of our mirror neurons and being able to kind of empathize and co-regulate and support.
Yeah. I hear you. Similarly, I really echo with like putting a snooze button on things. As you were speaking, it made me realize one thing I noticed just kind of even in my partner was that as the invasion into Venezuela by the US has meant that there's talks about Cuba being invaded. And so my
Mm,
partner, in since that event, it just made something click for me, which is that phone checking and checking of social media and kind of doom scrolling became increased, you know?
mm,
And so it's just like, I guess that would be the other guidebook question, is just like paying attention to what are the subtle shifts in behavior? What are the ways that panic or a lack of safety shows up? And just, how do we open up gentle conversations around these things?
yeah, yeah, that's very well
Yeah.
put. I appreciate you. I appreciate you sharing that. Yeah. Well, this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Tracy, for being a guest on Grown Between Worlds and for sharing your story and your wonderful wisdom with us today as well. Thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you so much, Ferouz. I'm so appreciative of you creating this space, and I'm just so honored to have been invited to participate. So thank you.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Thanks again for listening or watching this episode of Grown Between Worlds. We're grateful to share this space and community with you.
Please follow or subscribe to our podcast, share it with people who might resonate, join our newsletter for more info and resources, leave us a comment if you'd like, and join us again for future episodes. And remember, your story matters, your voice matters, and you're not alone. Grown Between Worlds is sponsored by Forouz Salari Online Counseling and Consulting.